In the midst of escalating tensions with Iran, a debate has emerged on the right about exactly what our overseas posture should be.
So Jim Antle, he's editor of the American Conservative magazine. He's author of Devouring Freedom, Can Big Government Ever Be Stopped? I think that a lot of people don't really understand the anti-war right. It's something that, it was a guest on this show had called it kind of a fringe outlier view. I think my counter would be that's where the entire Republican electorate is. So, Jim, can you just explain kind of your skepticism of the Trump administration's actions on Iran and really what the underlying kind of ethos from all of that comes from?
Well, I mean, interestingly enough, Donald Trump himself owes, I think, his election to the fact that he was different on foreign policy from a conventional Republican.
Agree.
That he didn't take the George W. Bush, John McCain position on these issues. He said that the Iraq War was a mistake, which shouldn't be a very big concession, but most Republicans,
Remember Marco Rubio literally stumbling over himself.
Basically, like 2 weeks before the campaign started, people were starting to say, maybe we shouldn't have done that. Maybe I wouldn't do it again, but I will do it again everywhere else.
Right.
But,
one instance was
that one was bad. Ara with a Q, bad. Ara with an N, good. No, the skepticism that a lot of Republicans have of government seems to stop if you start doing things overseas or if you blow something up. But if government spends money at home or does anything at home, that's inherently bad. I think that the same kind of skepticism that you should have, if you're skeptical of the idea that the federal government's going to do a very good job with your health care, you should be pretty skeptical of the idea that it knows how to create democracies overseas, that it knows how to turn the Middle East into a functioning political entity. And I don't think that we have that knowledge. And certainly the track record of the last 20 years suggests that while we're capable of defeating pretty much any military foe that we set our minds to defeating, that the actual idea of shaping political outcomes in these foreign countries, we're not very good at doing that, and that the outcomes for us have generally not advanced our interests. And then what we end up doing is we spend a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of blood and treasure just really so we don't look like we lose. So a lot of people end up losing limbs and lives so politicians can save face.
Well, I mean, Afghanistan's a perfect example, right? We learned from what the Washington Post published, the Afghanistan papers, that administration after administration was lying to the American public to try to convince them that we were winning the war when the opposite was true. It didn't matter what fact they could leverage. Oh, more people are being killed in suicide bombings. That means we're winning because they're desperate. Oh, fewer people are being killed. That means we're winning. Casualties are down, et cetera. So you see the way that the spin machine works just to convince people, rah, rah, we're the tough guys, go America. When in reality, with Iran, essentially what we're threatened with now is going to war to deal with the ramifications of the last war, which handed Iran war power, which destabilized the entire region, which essentially created ISIS, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. So then you have to even ask, what is the underlying mission in Iraq at this point? So we have a government that no longer wants us to be there if we take the initial vote at face value. We are there to prop up a government that doesn't want us to be there, that is closer to Tehran than it is to us, and we're going to stay there, have our troops be shot at by the Iranians to keep a government in power that is aligned with the Iranians. The whole thing doesn't make any sense.
For what?
And for what purpose? I mean, obviously even the initial invasion and that mission was very misguided. The weapons of mass destruction weren't there. You can go on through all the rationales that were used. Even that had, even if all of the facts turned out to be wrong, even that had some superficial plausibility that what we're doing now doesn't even have.
And so, Jim, why is it that this view is anathema in professional Republican circles? Donald Trump won on this message, right? This is literally what if you go look at the polling, this is what the Republican electorate wants to get the hell out of Iraq. They want to get the hell out of Afghanistan. The American
and veterans who've served in these wars.
Say, let's get out. America has voted 3 subsequent times in order to withdraw from war, but we're still there. What does that say about the Republican Party and about the national security bureaucracy?
Well, I mean, Barack Obama did encounter a similar problem. Now, his sort of did have to do with the fact that he ran against Hillary Clinton in the primaries. They needed as a concession to give Hillary Clinton something important in the administration. Unfortunately, the State Department running all foreign policy bureaucracy was what it was. And so that ended up yielding a very different foreign policy than what he ran on. Donald Trump, I think, part of the problem is that he didn't really view view as a businessman the opinions of his employees as being very important, but it actually is very important. You wouldn't, if you put a Chamber of Commerce Republican in charge of building the wall might not get built. Certainly, if you put a bunch of George W. Bush retreads in charge of your foreign policy, you're not going to get the foreign policy that Donald Trump ran at. Now, I do think there was always a situation where Iran was sort of an unprincipled exception to his America First skepticism of regime change wars. So there was always a real risk that if the John Boltons and company were put in these positions, President Trump was somewhat sympathetic to the idea of getting tough with Iran. He also wants to undo pretty much anything that Barack Obama did. That's an important priority for him, and the Iran nuclear deal was one of the things that he did. So this was going to set us up in a situation where even a candidate like Trump, who ran on the idea of getting out of these wars, there was a risk that if he followed sort of the logic of some of his rhetoric about Iran, we would end up with a bigger military footprint in the Middle East rather than a smaller one.
Sagar and I have talked on this show about how research proves that areas of the country that had higher casualties, that had higher losses from these wars, were more likely to vote for Donald Trump. So I think your theory that this was directly related to his election is pretty accurate. But talk about how that view has evolved on the right. Is it really just as a learning out of the true horror and cost of war that has been laid disproportionately among the multiracial working class of America? I mean, is that where this comes from, or was there an earlier strain there as well?
Well, I think when you talked even during the Iraq War, even when Bush was president, you talked to a lot of conservatives who specialized in budget issues. They were specializing in entitlements. They were skeptical of the Iraq War, particularly by 2005, 2006. You were starting to hear people quietly say, not sure this was a good idea. But being good disciples of Adam Smith, the conservative movement has tended to believe in specialization. So national security conservatives do foreign policy. Economic conservatives do economic issues and budget issues. Social conservatives handle social issues. And so you'd have people who would quietly say, I don't know if these disproportionately neoconservative national security guys really know what they're doing, but I'm a social security guy, so I'm going to kind of go over here. And that's become a problem in that even the people, the talent pool from which Donald Trump needed to draw to staff his administration didn't really agree with him on those issues. Typically, you basically take everybody from the previous Republican administration, bump them up a level, and that's kind of how you staff your administration. But on things like foreign policy and immigration, just bringing in the George W. Bush people wasn't going to get the job done. And it hasn't gotten the job done for Donald Trump on this, I think.
You know, Jim, I've tried to emphasize this too, because a lot of people, Bernie people, watch the show, and I try to tell them, I said, look, the same problem is going to exist if you try to come in. There is no actual professional bureaucracy that believes in what you believe.
Right.
You can have all the appointees you want, but a government is not the first 100 people. It's the first 10,000.
Right.
And those first 10,000, and I want you to talk about this more, have been inculcated in neoconservatism and in free market worship of economics. And that's a large reason about why the Trump administration has ended up the way that it is.
Right. I mean, I think, you know, if you go all the way back to Ronald Reagan, there were some people who were sort of movement true believers that he was staffing his administration with, and then some people were more George Bush types, and the George Bush types tended to have more government experience. So in a lot of internal battles, they won. It's been like that under Donald Trump, but it's been worse because at least the conservative movement pre-Reagan had decades of existing. A lot of what Donald Trump was running on, nobody in the Republican Party had run on in our lifetimes. So there wasn't that talent pool there.
Ross Perot was the last guy.
Ross Perot, Pat Buchanan. I mean, but they hadn't gotten to the point where they're staffing an administration.
They were one guy.
They were one guy. And so Donald Trump actually gets in. I think obviously the fact that his victory was a little bit of a surprise, maybe even to himself, factored into that, but also just his background, not really understanding the importance, I think, of the bureaucracy. These are the people who work for me. I tell them what to think. They don't tell me what to think. But it actually doesn't work that way, especially when you're staffing the government. So
that insight's very interesting.
The fact that they've had essentially the same people running in these positions when Trump ran on the opposite things, I think is a big factor in why we haven't gotten different results.
Really great perspective. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Next on Rising, New Hampshire journalist Paul Steinhauser. He's at the Iowa debate. He describes what's happening on the ground. That's next.